I'm honored to join you today for the CFTC's World Investor Week program, hosted by the Office of Customer Education and Outreach and the Office of Technology Innovation. 2023 marks the seventh year of the Investor World Initiative, sponsored by the International Organization of Securities Commissions. I am honored to join colleagues at the CFTC and regulators around the world as we focus on this year's themes, which include the expanding diversity and appropriate regulatory approach for the digital asset ecosystem. This includes the universe of cryptocurrencies, stablecoins, algorithmic stablecoins, non-fungible tokens, CBDCs, and many other coins and tokens, as well as issues at the intersection of finance and technology, or fintech. Alongside these innovative products, our focus must, of course, include efforts to reduce, if not prevent, garden variety, as well as sophisticated scams and deeply concerning Ponzi schemes. Social media has played a prominent role in the investor demographic shift we've witnessed in financial markets recently. While social media has grown over the past 2 decades, a more recent phenomenon is the use of social media to promote financial products. Social media enables faster, greater, arguably 24/7 access to the use of trading platforms. With a few quick taps on an app on your mobile phone, users can originate posts, transfer value, and execute trades. As IOSCO members noted in 2021, the increasing influence of social media on retail trading behavior has become one of the most significant trends affecting retail markets. Financial inclusion, however, must not leave those historically marginalized worse off. As our experience and enforcement suggests, and a 2022 Federal Trade Commission report demonstrated, retail investors are losing billions of dollars each year to fraudsters preying on them via social media. A significant driver of social media investment advice has stemmed from the growing popularity of cryptocurrency. In 2022, new investors in cryptocurrency outpaced new investors in any number of financial asset classes, including non-retirement accounts. Investor education and enforcement actions are critical to our efforts to prevent fraudsters from bilking hardworking investors. I'm thoughtful about our efforts toward enforcement, but I also want to encourage investors to stay alert by conducting research from reputable sources and guarding against the fear of missing out. You can avoid losses of assets that may never be recovered. I am hopeful that the presentations this week will assist in educating all investors and provide helpful resources to stay informed about potential scams and abuses on social media, as well as in cryptocurrency or any other asset class market. If something seems too good to be true, there may be a reason, and in fact, it may not be true. I encourage everyone to visit the CFTC's Investor Advisory page, which provides alerts and updates on prevalent frauds and enforcement actions that we are undertaking. I'm deeply thankful to Dan Rutherford for all of the hard work that he and his team put into planning and organizing the session today. I wish you all the best and look forward to seeing you soon.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Johnson. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's virtual event on stopping scams in a digital world. This two-panel special presentation is a recognition of World Investor Week, a global initiative organized by the International Organization of Securities Commissions, of which CFTC is a member. We joined colleagues across 6 continents this week to raise awareness about investor education and investor protection issues. And the topics we are talking about today are a significant concern to the CFTC and financial regulators around the world. Today's panel discussions are hosted by the CFTC's Office of Customer Education and Outreach and the Office of Technology Innovation. Just a quick rundown of today's agenda. Our panel will run for approximately 1 hour. We'll be stopping around 1:15. At that point, we'll have a brief intermission to seat the second panel. So just please stand by and bear with us and enjoy today's events. Before we get started, however, I would like to read the following disclaimer. Slide, please. This presentation is provided for general informational and educational purposes only and does not provide legal or investment advice, guidance, or interpretation to any individual or entity. The views presented herein are the speaker's own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission or the commissioners. References to any products, services, or resources, or the use of any entity, organization, trade, firm, or corporation name do not constitute or imply endorsement, recommendation, or favoring by the CFTC or the United States government. The CFTC does not guarantee the accuracy or completeness of any information contained in third-party resources or websites referenced herein. Now let's introduce our panelists. Okay, starting at the top, and we'll go clockwise. First up, we have Cameron Martell. Cameron is a PhD candidate at the MIT Sloan School of Management, where he focuses on the cognitive processes underlying the belief and spread of misinformation and other types of inauthentic behavior online. His research investigates the efficacy of different interventions on quelling disinformation, of dissemination of false information. Brett Olin is the Deputy Securities Commissioner for the Commissioner of Securities and Insurance in the Office of the Montana State Auditor. Brett has served as a regulator for 12 years and currently co-chairs the enforcement section of the North American Securities Administrators Association. Prior to his current role, Brett served as the Chief of Enforcement for the Nevada Securities Division and as an enforcement attorney and chief counsel for the Securities Division of the Montana CSI. In the lower left photo is Dotun Weinman, Assistant Director in the Division of Marketing Practices of the Federal Trade Commission's Bureau of Consumer Protection. Dotun has managed investigations, litigations, rulemaking, policy issues, and outreach and education efforts targeting deceptive and unfair practices in a number of areas, including cryptocurrency, investments, and investment training. Dr. Stacy Wood, PhD, ABPP, is the Molly Mason Jones Professor of Psychology at Scripps College in Claremont, California, and is board certified in geropsychology. Dr. Wood's research has examined factors that increase susceptibility in fraud victims, tactics that are commonly employed by scammers, and the psychological effect that these crimes have on the victims, with an emphasis on elderly victims. Dr. Wood has published more than 70 papers in peer-reviewed journals. And I'm your moderator, Dan Rutherford, Associate Director of the CFTC's Office of Customer Education and Outreach. Thank you, panelists, for joining us today. Our topic is exploring effective social media investment scam interventions. So I'd like to start by framing that out a bit. There's been a lot of discussion about the effects of social media on youth, on mental health, on politics, but there hasn't been much focus on social media and fraud. But we see from the complaints that we receive at the CFTC, and Dotun will speak to the data collected by the FTC, that many of the reported frauds originate on social media. And I don't mean to pick on any one platform, they operate similarly. First, we have seen a large number of new investors enter the market for the past few years. These newer investors tend to be younger, which means they have less investing experience. They tend to have lower financial literacy. They tend to invest in crypto assets, and they rely heavily on their own research, social media, and friends and family for investment information. Second, social media platforms are interactive and enable fraud to occur against many people at once, anywhere in the world. People you may know algorithms create like-minded groups of, for example, of risk-seeking speculators. Sense and suggest algorithms serve ads and content that keep users most engaged. Ad and content targeting helps fraudsters narrowcast to potential victims, which also allows them to hide their messages from authorities. And cross-platforming, jumping from one platform to, say, an encrypted group discussion, allows fraudsters to isolate victims and control the environment. Low quality information and disinformation from influencers may also lead new investors to bad outcomes. Finally, it's generally difficult to report or remove fraud. And in an attention-based business model, where consumers are naturally drawn to emotionally charged and novel content, one has to wonder about potential conflicts of interest. I know I'm painting with a broad brush, and the social media companies are not here to defend themselves, but this is the environment in which we find ourselves. And if we assume the status quo continues, how do we as educators, financial professionals, and regulators operate within it? How can we better protect investors? Dotun, to you first. What does the data tell us? How large is the problem of fraud in social media?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll start with the standard disclaimer that to the extent I will express any views today, they are my own views, not the views of the Federal Commission or any specific commissioners. To your question, Dan, the data that we collect shows how, as you said, central and important social media is to scammers today. They'll call it the scamming industry. The sheer size of it is just staggering. We have a database at the FTC that is called the Sentinel database. We get consumer reports and complaints from various sources, other regulators, state, federal, Better Business Bureau. We take all that data in and we spend a lot of time analyzing and see what the data tells us about trends and where fraud is most prominent. More than 25% of the people that reported being scammed between 2021 and June 2023 said that they were scammed through social media. That's by far the #1 tool right now for scammers to communicate and reach consumers. Consumers reported $2.7 billion of loss during that period. And I want to emphasize, it's very clear to us that a very small percentage of consumers actually report fraud. So 2.7 billion is the tip of the iceberg. The actual harm is much, much, much larger. Just the trend in 2019, 113 million harm was reported. Only 3 years later, in 2022, it was already close to 1.3 billion, 10 times that size. As again, that's just the reported harm, not the actual harm. We know that just a fraction of the actual harm. And we know that in 2023, we have information through June, it's going to be bigger, significantly bigger than 2022. So the actual size is, as I said, is staggering. That's by far the most effective tool right now and the most profitable tool for scammers. I would add a few other data points. Younger investors, as you noted, are much more likely to actually be scammed than older investors on social media, to the tune of, in terms of reporting, 4 times more likely. That's what we see from the data. We also know that the #1 category of people being scammed through social media is investment scam. Nothing can come close in terms of the loss. In fact, in the first 6 months of 2023, 50% of the money reported lost to scams on social media were for scams related to investment. So the trend is staggering. It's clear. It's getting better. It's getting worse. It's getting bigger. And it's specifically bad with respect to investment scams.
Thank you. Brett Dotun mentioned, that investing fraud is one of the biggest areas. And I know that one of the common frauds that we've been seeing a lot recently are romance-related scams, so-called pig butchering scams. Can you tell us a little bit about how are you seeing this as well at the state level? And what are some of the other common types of frauds and scams that you're seeing?
Yes, we are seeing it at the state level, as you can imagine. In fact, when I first started back in Montana back almost 1 year ago today, on average, we were receiving about one call every 3 to 4 weeks. And now Montana is a very small state. We've done some outreach, so there's some external factors related to romance and pig butchering based on our own internal statistics. Currently, we're receiving at least 4 to 5 a week about pig butchering and romance type scams. And I'm glad that you phrased those two things together, because people don't often think of pig butchering as a romance scam, but it really is, because it's a trust-based scam wherein a person makes contact with somebody who may or may not be a lonely person or a person who is isolated. They then take that confidence, get them to invest $10,000 or a relatively small amount, $5,000, $10,000, create fake crypto wallets. These people then invest in that, and keep investing a little bit at a time based on the returns which they're allegedly getting. Most often those crypto wallets are in the name of the person who is actually doing the scamming, or at least not, if not in the name, at least with access to those crypto wallets. Then when they start seeing these fudge spreadsheets about all the growth they have and they want to access that growth, they find out that there are additional fees. And so this is why they, I think, call it the pig butchering, is it's the fattening up of the trust and then the fattening up of the amount that they're actually stealing. Because then they say you need $2,000 to pay for your taxes to withdraw that, or you need $5,000 to pay the wallet custodial fees for that. And they just continuously take that money away. Regarding the romance element of it, in a recent case that we have here in Montana, the victim was so surprised that this was fake after the victim had already lost $40,000, because the perpetrator had been sending them pictures of their family and saying, oh, my family is utilizing this, the 10% that we're getting from you to be able to do this, and this is great, and you're making $600,000 and we're making, our 10% based on our advice, and here's my family. And so they were really appealing to the heartstrings of those people. So from a now, was it a traditional romance scam where older man finds older woman, or younger man finds older woman, or vice versa, or whatever the case may be? No, there was no romantic nature of it, but it's that trust nature of it that's so similar. And yesterday, as part of World Investor Week, we were presenting here in Montana to all of our investment advisors on these things, because we're struggling at the state level. And this is one of the reasons why I'm excited to be talking to this audience, is we're really struggling at the state level from an education perspective about who do we even talk to about this? Because if you're talking about an isolated, lonely male in the 50 to 65 range, which is a large percentage of the people who get pig butchered, like over 50% fit that demographic from our numbers that we've been looking at, or maybe not that much, 40% from the numbers we've been looking at. If those are the people that are getting scammed on pig butchering, how do we reach them? Do we reach them through their family? Do we reach them directly? Do we reach them through social services and organizations like that? And it's something that all the states are struggling with. And you can imagine Montana, one of the fewest lowest population states in the country, and yet we're getting 4 to 5 calls a week. Well, we have 1/50th the population of California, for example. So how often is it? And probably, and I certainly don't know this in regards to an average salary, a much lower average salary than the state of California. So how often is this happening and going unreported, where people aren't calling in? And then secondly, how much money is being lost in states with a larger economic footprint than what Montana has? As the co-chair of the NASA enforcement section, and that's the North American Securities Administrators Association. So all the states, both, and all the provinces of Canada and territories of Canada are a part of that. It's an issue which we're trying to deal with and trying to get our head around it. From an enforcement perspective, as you can imagine, it's very difficult, because most of these pig butchering schemes take place offshore. The money goes to a wallet. The person who has access to that wallet is based in Laos or based in China or something along those lines. Usually we've seen most of them being based in Southeast Asia. There's not a lot we can do. We have started to work with the FBI on trying to get access, some more tools in our tool belt, but to say that we have all the answers would be a myth. We don't. We are struggling to get answers from an enforcement perspective. And one of the big components of that is certainly education. So social media related, they all start on social media, whether it's TikTok or WhatsApp. What you'll see is starting off with innocuous conversations, which eventually move to, as Dan mentioned earlier, they eventually move to an offline, not an offline, but a non-public conversation, a private chat on one of these various things. It might be Facebook Messenger, it might be Line. I mean, there's so many different things and that are out there in regards to ways that they can communicate. The fraudster can communicate with the victim, and once they get them in that private chat, then all bets are off as far as how much money they're able to get from these type of scams.
And we recently wrote an article about how the money collected or circulating because of these romance frauds has grown to such a significant amount that it's actually leading to increases in money muling and other forms of illegality. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely, I can. In fact, we have a case right now that obviously I can't mention any names about it because it's still in the investigatory phase, but I can tell you exactly what happened from our perspective is that we had a person in a small town in Montana. She had an advisory account with a well-known firm. She liquidated that entire account and sent it to a money mule down in Los Angeles. They had formed an investment contract through text messages. So we were able to get our hooks into this particular case because of the text messages created an investment contract and because it came from an advisory account, which the Securities Commission regulates here in Montana. The one good thing that came out of this was not done just to a crypto wallet. It was actually put into the Money Mule's account in California. So we were able to subpoena all of those records and find out who that Money Mule is. Now, the Money Mule may or may not know how much is really happening here and what's really happening here, but the fact is that they're going to be culpable for that. And so we will ultimately, once we get the records back from the bank, which should be in the next week or two, we should be able to start identifying not only the money that went in from Montana, but other places where that money's gone, which will most likely not be from Montana. It just happened to be that the person that complained to us was that. So we're able to do that, and then we were able to pursue criminal charges in that case, and we certainly would be pursuing criminal charges for money flowing into or from Montana. That's the general jurisdictional hook that all the states utilize whenever we're dealing with wire fraud issues and things along those lines that might more traditionally be conceived of as FBI type of wire fraud actions or something along those lines.
Right, and for folks who may not know or be aware of what money muling is basically the practice of sometimes a person may know or may not know that they're participating in receiving money that was gotten through fraud or other illegal means and then forwarding it on typically to the fraudsters as part of a money laundering process. Dotun, are there other frauds that we see prevalently on social media that we haven't touched on yet?
Yeah, the two most pervasive ones are investment scams followed by romance scam. And there are many other scams that come after that. Imposter scams are also very popular, but really the two largest categories are romance and by far in terms of loss, it's investment scams.
Stacy, we've heard a lot about how, a lot of younger people are reporting frauds. We've heard how some of these romance scams are affecting older people. But how do these social media-based investment scams affect older investors?
Well, as you guys have been talking about with these demographic shifts, no age group is immune from fraud. Right now, it's an equal opportunity scam, but there are specific vulnerabilities that older investors have. For example, the scammers will curate the scam around particular interests and vulnerabilities. So, I mean, you all know about the grandparent scam. That was pretty obvious, but also by mimicking Social Security or other institutions, older adults are much more likely to engage with. A recent paper like last week in the Journal of the American Medical Association found they did a study where they put out lures for an imposter scam to 600 people. Almost 50% of the sample responded. 16% responded with no awareness of this type of scam, and 3/4 of them were converted in the scam. They asked for the last 4 digits of their Social Security number. So that's one way. Another important factor is that even though, again, younger people are equally vulnerable, older people are losing so much more money. And it's, from the Sentinel data, we know that the dollars lost per age group increases actually logarithmically or exponentially. So it's not and you might say, well, older people have more assets, but I think it's more than that, because like the 80-year-olds are kind of off the chart with monetary loss. They don't necessarily have more money than 60-year-olds. So I think there's a compliance issue that's happening too, that we need to dig in more. Why are they on the hook longer? And then of course we have the time horizon issue.
Mhm.
Older investors have less time to recover their and no time. A lot of my clients are retired.
Right.
And that sets them up for this vulnerable. To be sympathetic to the money mules, because I'm seeing a ton of them right. They kind of went away and now they're back. In my caseload, I'm seeing a lot of money mules now. And they're just desperate, right? They don't have a way to recoup those losses. So it really is devastating when it happens, to anybody psychologically, but there's some additional vulnerabilities for older people.
And you talked a little bit about, or touched on this a little bit, but besides its reach, do the elements of social media that I mentioned earlier make frauds more successful, more trustworthy, and how?
Well, I think that there's a couple of reasons. One is not specific to older people, right? You're connecting with a social network of trusted others and affiliations. So affiliation scams are longstanding, and now it's easier to create the appearance of some kind of affiliation through chat groups or other groups. And in addition to that, not to be too stereotypical, but another really common scam for older people right now are tech scams. So there is a subgroup of older people that are less, sophisticated in terms of social media, who may be vulnerable to particular types of scams secondary to that. And they also lose so much money. There's, I think it's like 10% of victims lose over $100,000 on these scams. So I think it's partly the typical affiliation, but then there could be sophistication issues that add additional risk.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned compliance, but what about issues like isolation?
Yeah, so AARP has looked at like what are factors that make people more vulnerable to fraud, generally. And they find that the person's current kind of emotional state is a huge predictor. That's true for younger adults too. So depression, isolation definitely increase risk. Stressful events in the past year are another risk factor that's been found. If you're an older person and you've lost somebody, you're just more likely to experience personal losses as you age. And those increase isolation and also set up the, psychological environment for scamming.
And so it fills a social need for folks that may not have social outlets otherwise, and that exposes them more to potential frauds. Is that essentially it?
Yeah, I mean, isolation and depression increase risk for all types of financial exploitation, including online.
Let's talk a little bit about solutions and interventions. Cameron, I know some of your work is focused on crowdsourced fact checking as a means to control disinformation. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found and the effectiveness of fact checking?
Yeah, sure. So there's good news and bad news about scams and fraud moving primarily to social media. The bad news we've touched on already. It's a real scale issue. The bar is lower to communicate with people, to make postings of new investment opportunities that are illegitimate. And then there are also specific aspects of social media that might ensnare people and make these frauds even trickier. These could be different algorithms and recommendations suggesting content to you, or suggesting new connections that may be inauthentic. There's more information about you available. This makes those affiliation scams that Dr. Wood mentioned perhaps even more plausible. And also, this has been brought up again, but the context of social media is distracting, it's emotional, and it brings your attention away from thinking about doubt and accuracy. On the bright side, a lot of these features, I think, can also be leveraged to scale up interventions like crowdsourcing and fact checking that some of my work has looked into. So one thing that can be done is it's lowered the bar for scammers to reach out. It's also lowered the bar for people who have seen scams, either who have unfortunately fallen victim to them or have seen but not responded to them, to let other people know about it. That includes government agencies, that includes message boards, telling friends and family, any collective place to make that reporting happen. So I think one actionable step that can be taken by organizations, by social media companies, is making it easier and encouraging this kind of reporting. So how do I go about if I see a scam sending in that information about the scam? Or if I'm not sure about something, can I look up the name of this person who's contacted me? Can I look up something about them? Where's that directory? Making that all more accessible for people to use, I think, is a good step forward. And I also think not only encouraging it and incentivizing that kind of reporting is good, but also making it clear that you're giving tips of how to identify as well. So that'll increase the reporting, giving that kind of financial advice that can be in the form of warning labels, such as if you find, if you know that websites are bad, adding it to a list of places where people have been scammed, but also where places are good, things that have been reputable, either from people that have said that they've had good experiences on these different sites, or have been verified by government or other agencies in some way. I think these are all actionable steps to take that kind of reverse some of the harms that the amplification of social media can cause.
Mm-hmm. And if the the fact checking, the reporting elements of the platforms don't change, does putting comments, fact checked comments in posts, or adding links to other resources in the comment areas of a video, for example, do those types of things have an effect?
Yes, I think those can go a long way. The research on persuasion and those kinds of tips show very little evidence of and very rare backfire effects. So it's very rarely going to go any other way. Even if you get comments or replies to that, it's important to think about the third-party effects of people that see it, might not be responding online, but are internalizing that information. That can be very helpful. Obviously, it would be best if social media companies add in different steps like friction and reminders themselves, but such as before you make a payment, before you leave a site and go to a private chat room, something to remind people people to be a little careful to verify that they know the person that they're sending money to. But even if that's not done at the platform level, it could be done in this way by adding these comments to message boards, posting it on people's feeds, encouraging people to share this kind of reminding information about taking a step back, being cautious, and reminding them to think about accuracy and have some doubt when engaging in these activities.
Yeah, and that's something that, you know, we've tried to do at the CFTC. And, you know, we talk a lot about the risks. And when I talk to other educators, you know, a lot of them don't feel comfortable, you know, maybe educating around the technology because they may not know that much about how the technology works. And so they're a little intimidated to counter or to bring up some of these issues. But, you know, for us in the financial education space, a lot of what we talk about feels old hat to us because we've said it over and over so many times. But I guess what you're recommending is taking that information back out, dusting it off, and putting it into this new context. For example, when we talk about risk, you know, we may not specifically mention how a particular coin works or its tokenomics, but it's still highly risky, and there are steps you can take to manage risk and steps you can take to verify. Is that sort of what you're talking about?
Yes, that's right. And I think that's especially helpful given the FTC data that Datan mentioned about young investors in particular, at least in the reporting data being more likely to be losing more money, especially in these online spaces. I think repeating this helpful information, giving these kinds of tips can go a long way. As well as just making it more visible, more attention grabbing in people's feeds, in private chat rooms, just making it salient to remember these tips and to have doubt when engaging in potential investment, shopping, different communications online. That's right.
Yes, Stacy.
Oh, I just had a question for you, Cameron. So what about the role of influencers? Like, you know, in terms of like just admitting they've been scammed, or I don't know if any of them ever do. Has that been looked at all as like, you know, as a tool for persuasion?
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I don't know about scams in particular, but some preliminary work that some of my colleagues are working on has looked at why influencers work. Is it like the content that they're saying, or is it some connection to them? And we find that it's more the latter. It's that people like trust these people on an individual level. So I think it would go a long way to have influencers and people that, whether they be influencers or other like personal connections, talking about their experiences with scams, giving these tips. Somewhat related, I think it's also important. One reason that some work has looked at of why people don't report is not only that they don't know how, which I think can be helped by, you know, being very clear about how to report these steps, making it easy, but also that they're not sure if it's worth it. They don't know what comes of it. They don't know if people get their money back, if they would get their money back. They don't know if reporting this very obvious scam to them could be helpful to others. They might not think that it's useful to give that reporting. So I think messages that encourage that, perhaps from influencers, perhaps from different organizations that are have these kinds of reporting mechanisms, also can go a long way to encouraging increased reporting. That helps from a data perspective, and it also helps from people being able to potentially look up and identify these scams themselves that others have seen.
Brett.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting as you're talking about what Dr. Wood just said and what Cameron said, just to follow up on it, as an enforcement attorney for most of my career who does these settlements, I'd be real curious to see when the SEC takes actions against Kim Kardashian or Tom Brady and makes them disgorge monies that they've been paid for supporting some of these scams, if they don't try to start including that as part of the settlement, because although they probably don't have any statutory authority to do it, in a consent agreement you can do a lot of things, and it'd be real interesting to see if they said, you know what, as part of your community, as part of your agreement, you're also going to do some education in regards to this stuff, and admitting, not just admitting what you've done, but then also looking at admitting, educating people on what you've done. That's a really interesting point, and something that I think when I'm looking at scams here in Montana, we would certainly look into. So I appreciate you bringing up that point.
Yeah, and it's influencers are an issue that IOSCO is also currently looking at. Not only, well, primarily in the area of people giving out bad advice and being unlicensed and recommending certain investments, and obviously that causes problems, and like I said, has bad outcomes for people. But maybe there's opportunities to educate and persuade some of these influencers to pass along better information, but it's also about recruiting quality influencers or those who are more mainstream press to get out and talk more about what's true and what's authentic when it comes to investing. So
at that forum that we hosted yesterday, Dan, it's funny you say that because we put up opposing things and we had a picture of Tom Brady in regards to FTX, and he eventually had to settle. He and Giselle both paid back $1 million or $2 million or something like that. But then we put up a picture of Taylor Swift, who was approached and didn't agree to be an influencer in that thing. And so then we put up a WWTD, which was what would Taylor do? Because Taylor said, I asked my attorneys about it and they said they weren't even sure it was an unregistered security or not. And then they asked FTX and FTX never responded. So Taylor never endorsed them despite the amount of money that could have been paid to her. So one of the things we were pushing on people was, what would Taylor do?
Mm-hmm. And looking at this, Brett, I mean, from your perspective, again, as a regulator from a small state, there's a lot of financial education out there, but you have a small financial education office. So what is it that you would need? What are some things that we and the federal agencies, maybe from the financial services industry, what is it that others can do to make your job easier?
Yeah, and I think from our perspective, it's that, so we've recently hired a financial education outreach specialist here. So that's a step in the right direction. Of course, funding is always the issue, but we've found, and she's only been here for 4 months, so we have not explored all the options that are out there for her. But one thing that we have found is working with these types of groups, whether it's the CFTC coming in, FINRA coming in, AARP, all of these types of group, just being able to be present and having her present whenever they're having meetings, conventions, things along those lines makes a big difference. Because I think when you were reading my title earlier in the introduction, and everybody was in, and I think my title alone takes up about 30 words. People don't even know to call the Montana State Auditor when they have an investment issue, when they have a problem and they've been scammed. And so just and we've tried to change our name constitutionally. We've been unable to do it. It's in the Constitution of Montana that it is what it is. And so life moves on that way. So we have to really get it out there. And one of the great ways for us to do it is if anybody's doing something in Montana, whether it's Senator Tester, Senator Daines, working with the AARP, working with FINRA, working with any of the organizations, just let us be in the back of the room and letting people know that we're here to help as well. And that's been a big focus of our outreach coordinator, has been trying to make sure that we have all those connections, especially with our really small communities. So we have the budget to be able to go out to the communities and present a couple of times a year, but we're only touching a very small percentage of the people of Montana when we do that. Right. So the more people that we can touch, even if it's passively, is helpful.
Yeah, and I know, we talked a little bit about who do we influence and how do we reach particular groups. And I think it's important, one of my tips would always be, think about who we as the agency have the most influence over and use that as a persuasive technique to get them to do more, right? To do some recruiting, do some organizing, and continuing that message to amplify what we're trying to say, which was, I think, what Cameron was talking about. Dotun.
So I think one thing that we have to acknowledge is also the platforms that are being used here. And this is a very different type of enforcement and education. When you had scams that are just randomly, on TV or for everybody to see, it's easier for us to follow on that. But when you have scams coming through social media that are using data that they are getting from social media platform to target specific consumers and to hone in on those that are most likely to be susceptible to scam, that puts some responsibility, and I'm not necessarily saying legal responsibility, but certainly some responsibility on the platform. And we are very curious about that. The FTC issued orders to all the big names, TikTok, YouTube, Meta, Twitter, etc., and asked them about how they monetize this stuff, how they generate those ads, how they do onboarding and monitoring, how they educate consumers about this kind of speech that is out there that is deceptive speech. And I think a lot of our work going forward will be informed by the answers that we get and what can we do with the platforms to fight that issue.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've always noticed is that there's no real easy way to, like I say, report a fraud on social media. We've had a big issue with imposter frauds ourselves. And, when I try to go and tell, report that this person doesn't really work for the CFTC, but they're actually out there committing a scam, there's nowhere for me to do that and to actually get action. Do we know if, blocking or just submitting those reports have an effect? And is that something, we talked about encouraging reporting. Does that type of activity algorithmically or programmatically have an effect on who's getting taken down or who's allowed to continue to broadcast?
I would just say blocking, we have studied different effects of when people block on social media. And it's a really important tool that I believe the Apple App Store requires social media companies to have blocking for this purpose. I think it goes a long way individually to be able to block. However, there are limitations to leaving that on the individual to take that action. You might not know how to block on that platform. Sometimes it's multiple buttons. It's often a lot harder to block than to follow someone. A lot of social media companies even have more complicated ways to block a lot of people. You can add like block lists on Twitter. At least you used to be able to. I'm not sure anymore. But those require knowledge of how to enact. And so I think making reporting even easier than it is now. Again, you can flag content on, let's say, Facebook as being misleading and authentic. You can report scams, but the response time to action being taken can vary a lot. And also, there's nothing to stop the producer of that scam or fraud from making a new account. It can pop up again. Same thing if the platform bans someone entirely. There are different ways that they can make more accounts. If they're of more interest, perhaps there can be action taken more. But a lot of it's like at the company level of how these enforcement policies are actually being taken. And that's leaving it a lot of the burden on the individual and consumer themselves, and a lot of ambiguity and variability in how companies are actually like taking these enforcement actions.
Doten and then Stacy.
One, it's hard to get, our experience, it's really hard to get things blocked and even get information on a case by case from the platforms. One more promising avenue is educating, especially the elderly, about how you can limit your exposure to social media, who can see your posts, what kind of post is commercial contact as opposed to your friends and so forth.
Right. Stacy.
Oh, I was just going to ask if there's some like Better Business Bureau type of place that we could direct consumers to that talks about some of the worst offenders, and maybe they're actually in this room. Where do you suggest consumers go?
FTC.gov has a lot of information that if you put FTC social media, you're immediately going to get the link on Google to go there or whatever other search engine you're using. And I think there are a lot of good tips that are very easily read and if complied with, really reduce the risk.
And then I had a question for Brett, like with other type of scams, sometimes we can enlist the help of banks or brokerage companies, with money laundering, rules, they have to report, they can slow things down. Is that effective with these type of scams, and why not?
Yeah, that's a great question. So earlier I was talking about an ongoing scam that we're investigating right now. And we looked at all the policies and procedures of the investment firm, and the investment firm didn't do anything wrong whenever they were analyzing the withdrawal of $130,000 from the account. not based on their own policies and procedures, but based on simple logic. The type of account that it was susceptible to a large withdrawal in one chunk whenever people wanted to direct it themselves, and they'd get so many red flags. And that always becomes the issue when you're dealing with both banks and investment firms, is what's the balance of false flags to real scammy type of issues. And this one, it didn't, and quite frankly shouldn't have raised any red flags with the firm. It was a very normal transaction. And so the best that we've been able to do is to just, we work in Montana, we work with all the state registered banks and credit unions. The banking division director and myself are good friends. And so that's been a nice relationship that's kind of helped us on some of these things. But we do have the report and hold requirements and everything else, the Senior Safe Act that NASA put out a couple of years ago in regards to that, allows that to happen. And so the best we can do is educate the people in the industry about that. And those buy and hold, if you see something dodgy, if something comes across, if something triggers a flag, that you can, hold that transaction for a period of time, depending on which state you're in. In Montana, it's up to a month while you complete your investigation on it. With some interloping steps, like you have to go to a judge at some point and say, hey, judge, we're still looking at this, but we don't think this transaction should go through. But it takes a village, I guess, is the cliche mantra that we all think about whenever we're trying to stop this. And going back to what I said at the very beginning, which was, we're trying to figure out, one, what is our target audience to be able to stop this stuff, and two, and that's why I'm so excited to have you and Cameron and people who are really researching this stuff on this type of phone call, because there's just so many different elements to stopping this stuff that are a real challenge for us on the enforcement side of things, because it's like, gosh, sure be nice if we can not get 5 calls a week on this issue.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that raises, a couple of different points. One, we've seen, when we first started experiencing some of these romance scams, they were targeting younger people, and typically more female than male. And since then, it's shifted. It shifted from, the mainstream social platforms like Facebook and Instagram to LinkedIn, where people were able to target based on profession and income and location and et cetera, to now we're seeing more SMS random calls that are, quote unquote, wrong number calls. And so it changes. The targets do seem to change. FinCEN also recently put out an advisory, I want to say maybe a month or two ago, on pig butchering frauds. And, so that raises the idea, at least, of, there is a distinct pattern that the fraudsters put the victims through to transfer their money, right? So the first step is generally a transfer from a bank to a cash market crypto platform. And then from that cash market crypto platform to the scammer's wallet. And so when you see that occur once, maybe that raises a red flag. If you see it twice, maybe that signals you should push an email to that person and say, hey, you might be potentially involved in a fraud. I mean, just to, we don't see a lot of that. I mean, we see some of that occurring in the banking industry, but I don't know that we've seen that too much from the crypto industry. But, that could be a potential, intervention point.
One of the things that Cameron was talking about earlier about the limiting Facebook profiles to kind of friends and family or whatever you want, and things along those lines. And one of the things that we've started here as part of our outreach person, and we hired a Gen Z person to do our investor outreach because we figured they knew what was best and what was going on right now. And lo and behold, she comes up with this project. I think she'd seen it somewhere, where she's training high school students to work with seniors and everything else on doing exactly what Cameron was talking about. Is, all right, we're going to put these two generations together, which seem disparate at so many levels, and say, all right, you're going to work with these people and get them to really block a lot of the stuff. That doesn't solve the SMS problem or anything like that, the random wrong number type problem, but at least it's a start in that direction. So we're throwing it all up against the wall. We'll report back in 2 years ago when we tell you when we find what 2 years from now when we find what works.
Yeah, great. And, we talked when we all spoke earlier, we had a conversation about point of sale interventions. And, we know that younger investors, newer investors also rely quite heavily on their parents for information. So, Cameron, you had your hand up. Why don't you speak to maybe what are not only the online or technical interventions, but, let's brainstorm or think about what are some potential offline interventions? And I'd like to hear from the rest of the panel on that as well.
Yeah, sure. To Brett's point, I think that's a great approach of having younger people and people that are maybe more tech savvy going through these different privacy features and other aspects of social media that other users might not be aware of. I think also maybe from a regulatory level, encouraging use of this as like a default is useful. If the default was to have more stringent privacy, rather than having to switch to that, might be useful and have even larger effects. So on the question of if there are offline interventions, I think from a similar framework of adding that kind of friction or reminder is very useful. I think literacy and digital tips interventions that maybe are telling others how to teach those as well, instead of just directly first order, but encouraging these like third party effects might be very useful. And so I think those kind of offline strategies of reminding people not only to watch out for themselves, but to watch out for others that might be at risk in their lives is also useful. But Dr. Wood might be able to talk more about some of those offline work.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I wish the research was more promising, but what we do know is that awareness does help. So if you are aware of a specific scam, that does decrease risk. The problem we have is that our scammers are always, changing, and creating these hybrid scams that can morph from, romance to investment, et cetera. What I see with these victims is that they get into this panicked or highly emotional state, and they don't talk to other people. And the scammers reinforce that. We were talking about the role of isolation earlier, but the scammers actually try to foster that. And so any way you can puncture the ether, as they say, right? Any way you can engage with a person when they're in that heightened emotional state and allow some time to slow down and engage deliberative reasoning, it can be pretty effective. So, and in fact, there has been some research on phishing and other types of scams that show like just taking some time decreases risk. I know that sounds obvious, right? But to slow down, but it remains good advice.
Yeah, that any research showed, I think, and like Professor Wood said, that resisting the rush, rush is a red flag. That really is one of the most important flags, red flags. If it's a good investment opportunity, it's going to be there tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, if it's legit. Anything that you're being pressured to do immediately, and don't, of course, the instruction, you don't have time to speak to consult. If you can stop that rush, if you can recognize and send that message, and we are trying to do it in outreach, that any pressure to do things now, walk away. The other thing is methods of payment. It's less relevant for investment scams, but certainly for romance scams and other scams. When you're being asked to pay with crypto or with gift cards, which might sound a little bit funny, but it's actually really pervasive, especially in imposter scams. Don't do it. If it's a legitimate exchange, they are not going to ask you to pay with gift cards, and they're not going to say that only crypto is the means. Credit card is the most secure way to have a chance of getting your money back. The other methods, like as I say, crypto, gift cards, and even the payment apps that we are using a lot these days, like Excel, it's like cash. Once it's out the door, you're not going to get it back. So if somebody say to you, I cannot accept credit card, that's another big red flag.
So one tip that I would have, especially for some of my fellow agencies out there, is, making your content more shareable. We put, like I said, we have a lot of content that's out and available. A lot of times it's legacy content that's been, maybe written 3, 4, 5 years ago. Bring it back out, refresh it, make sure you have links and make it shareable, so that visitors who come, maybe that parent could share that information easily with their college student, for example. And then just being more active and more engaging on social media. I know that is difficult sometimes given, privacy concerns and other issues that go with, being a public agency and speaking on social media, but it really does, have an effect. Brett, did you have something?
Yeah, thanks. And I apologize to everybody. I had my scheduling messed up and I thought we were finished at 11 and we're finishing at 11:15 and I'm going to have to jet. But I just want to, these type of dialogues, these type of conversations, especially with the different multidisciplinary thing, because I've learned so much from especially Cameron and Stacy. Dotan and I are kind of in the same boat, but Cameron and Stacy, just hearing what you guys have to say, both in our prep meeting and today, has been really helpful. And I think that it's all part of the picture, and we don't have the answers from an enforcement perspective. We have some answers. We have them, when things come to enforcement, it's very targeted. It's one thing. I'm solving this problem. I'm solving this problem now that's right before me. That I can do. Trying to stop things on a whole or trying to arrest problems that are percolating is our biggest challenge. And so I want to thank you all for the time to meet with us today, and apologize again for having to leave early.
Thank you, Brett, for joining us. And, like I said, the more that we can get out there and communicate and have these types of discussions with the public, the better. My office exists for that purpose. And I know there are a lot of other agencies that have outreach offices. So for those of, those folks out there who might have limitations in terms of what they can do, publicly, feel free to reach out. There are always options available. And thank you for joining us, Brett. It's been great. We're sorry to see you go early, but completely
Sorry.
understand.
My apologies. Bye-bye.
That's all right. Take care. So for the rest, what I'm hearing is multimodal. I'm hearing a lot more content is necessary. And partnerships maybe with between industry and government, between academic and industry and the government. Is there anything else? Am I missing anything here in terms of what do good interventions break through, resonate, etc.? Go ahead, Stacy, and then Cameron.
Yeah, I mean, something I'd like to see happen kind of more in our culture is the narrative switch from blaming people when they're victimized or they didn't do their research to supporting people who have been scammed, to help, increase awareness, and also to, better develop interventions, ideally to prevent, but also to support in the aftermath. Like these victims of these pig butchering scams are devastated. I mean, they may not stop till they've gotten every single dollar, right? And so they also try to push out the real family members and support during the process. So at the end of the day, the person's super isolated and broke. So I would like to see a narrative change where we're talking more about scams and victimization to normalize it, so there's less blame, and maybe that would help with using this amplification for good.
And we talked a little bit about that on our pre-call, which was, when people are involved in these pig butchering scams, and I've spoken to a few victims who were involved in this, and they say, well, when you're in the middle of it, mom and dad can't even break in and tell you something about what's going on. does peer counseling help? Is there, victims, stories from people that have experienced these types of things? I mean, does that tend to resonate and help people avoid these frauds?
I don't know if it helps them avoid it. It definitely helps them recover.
Okay.
Support groups that include other people who have been victims of fraud. We're pilot testing some of that in Los Angeles. Unfortunately, there's just going to be more and more, right? So it's not this niche area of psychology anymore. But I think if we were talking about it more as a culture, then a person might be able to break through. Like, this sounds like one of those pig butchering scams we were talking about.
Right. Cameron, you had something you wanted to comment on?
Yeah, I think that Dr. Wood's totally correct in needing to reframe the narrative around victims of fraud. I think the AARP has done a really good job kind of communicating this message in recent years. And I think it goes a long way, not only reactively in helping people recover after the fact from these, if knowing that it's normalized, it happens a lot, but also proactively. And this could be through both making people more ready to report when they see or fall victim to these things. That helps inform data, that helps us know what trends are changing. As you mentioned, who's being targeted by what kinds of scams is updating constantly. And Dotan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think even though the number of dollars lost has been increasing every year from FTC reports, the number of reports themselves are about constant or decreasing, which is bad. That doesn't mean that fewer people are being scammed. That means that not enough people are reporting, since we know that these kinds of frauds are very widespread. So I think changing the narrative can help more people actually feel comfortable reporting, especially if they see outcomes happening and if it's easy for them to do so. And I think it could also change from how willing regulators, social media companies, different people in positions of power are to actually take actions that might be even stronger in putting the burden on the people who are perpetrating these crimes, rather than saying, oh, well, the victim should have known better. I think that changing that is really important from making this a more salient issue to be addressed proactively, rather than waiting until it's too late in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I completely agree and have said for years, it's not about being gullible or not knowing that this goes on. It's really about catching someone at the wrong moment. Or catching them in a blind spot, right? Dotan, any comment or any thoughts about ways we could increase reporting?
I think it's true that the people don't like to complain. People don't like to think about themselves as victims. So anything we can do to explain and share that there's no shame in that, has been said, that would be very helpful. In terms of what Cameron said about more enforcement, I think that that is something that I support, and I think that there's so much of it right now. We are at the FTC. We have rulemaking with respect to earnings claims, that we are now in the process of receiving comments from the public on, and we really are trying to reach out and hear from every interested party about what we can do better in terms of the rule and our enforcement area, and work in this area, which we share with you guys at the CFTC and the SEC, and really trying to think creative and reach the largest crowd that we can to receive input on that about this issue.
Okay, well, here's a good question. So are there any suggestions on how to make content more appealing to the general public for awareness? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think having short form videos is a very good captivating way, like TikTok playing. But my main advice is to, once you make different creatives, make different posts, just do like small little pilot tests of them, which I'm sure you already do some version of, but like make many. it's kind of hard to predict a priori what's going to stick like ahead of time, what's going to work. But once you have a lot, you can kind of test out in smaller samples through launching different ones on different platforms at different times and see which one. So a lot of test and evaluate and iterating through. But my place to start would be in kind of that like engaging short form video content. I think really gets people at the engagement level and draws people to attending the content at all. One big problem with like the types of digital literacy tip interventions that in the experimental work have been tested is it's often in the context where people are attending to the tips. And so pulling people in to like actually focus on the tips is a really important first step that I think should be the focus of a lot of the testing for what's going to work.
And has there been any work looking at media literacy in terms of its effectiveness in avoiding disinformation or fraud?
Yeah, so I can speak to both misinformation and investment fraud, providing tips. This has even been done just like short form bullet points of the main things to watch out for. It can be like, think about accuracy, look for like urgency being pushed, look for any suspicious spellings, typos, different things that seem out of the ordinary. These are helpful broadly. One potential downside is for digital literacy tips on investment fraud. It seems that the effects are larger for people that already have some baseline higher financial literacy. That might be because these tips are pretty basic and more like reminders and teaching people. So I think for like people who don't have as much investment knowledge coming into it, it might be important to really start from the basics, explain concepts, have like more engagement. Whereas people that already have some baseline of investment, financial, or digital literacy might just need reminders to think about it. Because if you're online all the time, a lot of distracting content, it's probably not top of mind to be considering that you might be faced with a fraud or scam in your newsfeed.
Yeah, build some heuristics, right? Stacy, any thoughts?
Well, it's interesting. You know, a big factor related to victimization appears to be confidence and overconfidence.
Right.
So on the other side of the coin, we were doing a project looking at younger and older adults and found it was easier to teach older adults the heuristic, like of, you know, like have privacy and, you know, don't engage with people you don't know, or whereas younger adults, they had more confidence in their ability because they're online more, that they'd be able to spot like illegitimate or content that was disinformation, which actually kind of paradoxically increased their vulnerability. So same with investors. There has been some research showing that if they have more exposure, they've invested before, they're also maybe overconfident at spotting scams.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some recent FINRA research also mentions, you know, how newer investors, especially those who invest in crypto, tend to think they know more about crypto than they actually do. There is a level of overconfidence there. And like you said, I think people have especially younger people, have kind of a trust bond with their smartphone, right? And you actually have to think about, it's not, you know, it's not that relationship with the phone, but the people who are sending you the messages through that phone that are dangerous and something to keep an eye on. Dutton, as we close out, any thoughts?
Yeah, there's actually a question that I saw in the chat about how you incentivize the platform to work more on this area, and specifically monetary incentive, which of course these are private company, they care about their bottom line. It's a hard question. I think that protecting their brand is a big deal. Mm-hmm. And I think if you make it known that a particular platform is very susceptible to scam, you make it example and you show how these scams are being done and how easy it is to do it on that platform, that can have some implication on the people that care about their bottom line and protecting their brand. The second thing, which is the trickiest one, and that's really less for agencies, more for the people that we elect, is can you hold them responsible in certain situation? And that's certainly a a motivation to be a good citizen sometimes when you know that can be a penalty if you're not.
Good point. And, on the flip side of that, the other thing I would just throw out to those who might be listening is that new investors value education. They actually start investing to learn about investing. And they seek out quality information. And we've seen that new investors that started in 2020, by 2022, were relying less on their own research and more on more traditional informational sources. So for those who are out there who are providing financial education, the opportunity is there. We just have to get out there and produce more content and do more social outreach, it sounds like.